So there we go. So we will be having the recording done. So if anyone has to leave early, no worries. We will send this out afterwards. So before we jump into content, just looking at the poll, I think we can see. Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it looks like for the poll, it looks like we've got a split between 35% CS leaders, 35% CS team members, and then the rest kind of in other roles. And looks like we're all over the place. We've got Austin, Texas, and Vancouver, Indiana. We got Brazil, we got Canada, we got Toronto, Atlanta. So it's great. I'm so glad everybody was able to make this time work. And then our first jobs, which are always fun, we had a janitor for their parents' company. We've got an owner of at a vintage store, the owner's right hand at a vintage store, mowing lawns, office coordinator, call center agent, supply chain folks, engineering, secretary, graphic designer, McDonald's in a customer facing role, consulting. Oh, and my favorite, a roadie. So that's awesome.
That's great.
Which is fantastic. Okay, cool. And then for our scaling, kind of where we are, it looks like the most are in this kind of other category, but we do have, one who's attempted to scale but hasn't gone well. So that'd be great to hear some of those road stories as we go. And then it looks like 3 of you are about to start some scaling initiatives, and then there are another 3 of you that you're not actively working on it, but you probably should start thinking about it. Nobody on here has said they're a scaling expert, so that's kind of where we are today from who we've got with us here.
Well, hopefully we can help get you there.
That's cool.
Jen, you want to go ahead and share your screen, and we'll start diving right into content?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We're really happy to have you here. We have an hour. We're probably going to use about half an hour, 40 minutes or so for content. And then at the end, we left a good amount of time for just Q&A, that kind of thing. Now, that being said, a couple of housekeeping things. We love to have the video on, but we understand that sometimes there's things that you need to be doing, or children running around, or that sort of thing. So no worries. If you can keep yourself muted, that would be great. Feel free to use the chat during the session to throw in questions, or use the hand raise feature, that kind of thing, but we will have Q&A at the end. And we're going to start with just a couple of quick introductions. So first of all, I'll start with myself. I am Bethia Haskell. I am a revenue architect here at Winning by Design. I am based in Austin, Texas. I've been with Winning by Design for a few years, but I have been working in recurring revenue companies since about 2000 in Austin, companies of all sizes, from little tiny startups all the way through to public companies, primarily in CS practitioner roles, leadership roles, some business operations as well. And my first job, and I'm not counting babysitting in this one, but my first job was actually as a TDD operator for the deaf outside of Washington, DC. So I would, back before computers were as ubiquitous, people who were unable to use the phone in here would dial into our service via a computer, type in, and I would be the oral translator for ordering pizzas or calling friends or whatever it was. So that was my first job. So Jen, what about you? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Awesome, cool. So my name's Jen. I'm also a revenue architect here at Winning by Design, and also based in Austin, and I've worked in numerous roles in CS, really kind of everything kind of post-sales, from onboarding, CS, account management, ops, support teams. So just kind of that whole gamut there. And my first job was at Target, working in the close section, or if you're in the industry, soft lines is what we called it. And so I still can never wear red and khaki again without flashbacking to my Target days. Okay, awesome. Let us dive right in. So we are going to, when we talk about scaling, it's complex and it's meaty. We have broken our discussion into kind of 2 phases. We're going to touch briefly on the high level philosophical things that you want to be considering, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the tactic piece of it. So philosophically, we're going to cover what is good scaling, what is it? When do you do it? What does good look like? And it is not right for every organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about who it's not good for, right? Some signs to look for there. And then when we talk about scaling, sometimes it's easiest to think about what it's not when you're trying to decide what it is. And so automation, it's certainly part of it and it's extremely helpful, but there's this misconception that scaling means automate everything. The machines are going to come in and take over all of our jobs. And that's definitely not the end goal, nor is it let's slash half of our headcount. And it's especially not let's overload our CSMs with more work, right? And when we think about it's not as much limiting services, it's more about right sizing, right? And really figuring out what does a customer need to be successful, and then how do you deliver it? And some customers just don't need quite as much to get to the impact that they're looking for. So those are kind of the high level of what to think about it of what it's not. And when we shift to think about what it is, it's really looking at taking these proven processes and trying to expand them out. And the key here is proven, because you can certainly scale bad processes. And I've certainly been part of organizations where we've done that, and it's terrible, right? So making sure you get really good, you know it works, and then how do you kind of expand on it? And then we're also going to look at, how do you find those magical one-to-many options? It's not every company can do this. It's not a right strategy for everyone, but if you can find it, it a lot of times can be a win-win, right? You can use less resources by having some group trainings. It takes less on your side from a resource, and then it's great for the customer, right? They get to network, they get to hear from others like them. And so looking for those is always good. And then we're going to talk a ton about leveraging technology and data. So I'm not going to belabor that here, but I will call out that to properly scale, you need the right tech stack, and please have the right data. I think everybody's been in organizations where the data is a mess and it kind of throws things off. And so those are really, really critical for you to be able to scale. So you've got to have these kind of foundations to kind of set up on.
So let's start by taking a step back and just talking about how recurring revenue companies grow to begin with. There's this very organic thing that happens. Usually startups begin, they're very scrappy in nature. You have a founder, maybe a co-founder, who are just amazing, have this great idea, so much passion and intelligence behind it. They bring in a couple of superstars, and it's all about grit and determination and drive and just getting things done. So they start off building a MVP, start building out tactics and pricing. Then you start figuring out what works in terms of their pitch, getting deals, building customers, and you're still leaning on these superstars. This is what's driving the company. As you keep going and you're adding more customers, you're adding tools, you're adding processes, you're adding more leaders in there to support them as well. Again, more processes, all of this based on this foundation of superstars. The growth continues, and what often happens is there's this idea that you want to scale the human qualities. So the company's focused on hiring the right kind of people that had the qualities of those early superstars, that grit, that intelligence, that drive. That's what's going on. And meanwhile, we're piling all of these things on top of this very specific culture. More and more growth keeps going. And because we haven't shifted into a systems way of thinking about our company, and we're still really focused on human qualities, we just haven't taken the time to revisit and focus on rebuilding that foundation. And when you're focusing on human qualities, managing an organization, you often reward people when things are successful, but you also tend to look for humans to blame when things fail. So a lot of us have probably been at companies where this has happened. You've had this rapid growth, things start to get a little wobbly, some things start to fail. Maybe a VP is pulled out, a new superstar brought in, they bring in their own tools, processes, people, all that kind of thing, which honestly just ends up destabilizing things a little bit more. That ends up not working, and at some point, if that foundation isn't revisited, things do start to fall apart. So how do we avoid this? We want to talk about one of the models that we use at Winning by Design called the growth model. All recurring revenue companies follow a growth pattern. It is this S curve. You can see the line that's in here in this graph. Companies start off slower while you're figuring out your product, your fit, all those kind of things. At some point, you start to pick up pace and you get that steeper line. And as you, hopefully, if you're successful, you start hitting your total available market and the line starts to balance out, giving you that S curve. So there's 4 stages within this curve for companies that are growing appropriately. There's that startup phase where you're figuring out what works. You move into this scale up phase where you're doing more of what works and stopping doing what doesn't work. Somewhere in there, you might have an IPO, and then you get into the grown up phase where it's about increasing efficiency, lowering costs. And then if you're really successful and get into that enterprise phase, then it's about how do we increase our total available market through either acquisition or launching new products, that kind of thing. To double click in on the next slide to what's going on ahead of and right after that scale up bit, we're going to look at that growth curve in a slightly different way. In this image, you can see the little black bubbles with the S in the bottom left, which is your funding round, your seed funding. Then you see A, your A funding round, B, C, D, IPO, so forth. What's really important to know as you go along this growth curve is in that product market fit part there, you're really just figuring out what's going on. Ideally, once you get your A round, now what you want to do is really focus on learning what works and what your proven processes are. You notice how that blue line is really squiggly in the beginning, really up and down. That's because often at this point in time, you might have a really great quarter, but then you might have a really bad quarter because you just haven't quite solidified things. You're learning as you go. Ideally, if you're doing things right in this phase, you are learning and adjusting your processes as you go so that your forecasting gets better, your outcomes are more predictable, and that blue line starts to flatten. You want to get that line under control before you start scaling. So when we talked about in the introduction that there's a time to scale, very often we see companies trying to scale too early. And to the point that Jen made before, it is just as easy to scale that very squiggly line of unpredictability as it is to scale something that you know is proven and smooth and works. So what we want to talk about today is how to know when you're at that point, hopefully ahead of your C round that is usually used to scale, so that you can make the decision at the right point in time.
Any thoughts here or any comments people want to put in the chat? Does this resonate? Is it tracking? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Does this kind of match what you've seen in reality? This this building of stabilization, it all kind of crumbles down and kind of that projection there over time.
I know for a fact that more than one of you have seen that crumbling of the foundation when things haven't been stabilized.
Yeah, I think we've all lived it up for sure.
Yeah, Nadine, good point. You always want to be thinking about how you will scale as you're building your processes and at that A round and all of that, but not necessarily do it until you know that what you have in place is going to work and you're ready to scale it.
Yep. All right, perfect. So what does good scaling look like? So I said earlier that we're not going to automate everything, but automation is certainly key to it. And here's where you want to really look at, I think every team I have ever worked with, you've got CSMs, you've got AMs, you've got all kinds of folks that are doing like really manual work. It's like this could totally be automated if we just put a little bit of effort into it. So certainly look for those. What are those things that you can just completely eliminate and make automated and get rid of that manual work that is not particularly enjoyable for most team members to do anyway. And then we also want to look at those one-to-many programs, and you can do this by some trainings and things like that. But then the other thing you can look at is some drip campaigns. And our friends in marketing and sales, they do this all the time. And for some reason in CS, we tend to steer clear of it, right? But really looking at, we'll talk about kind of mapping that customer journey, but figuring out, are there areas in your customer journey that would make really good sense to put in some drip campaigns, right? So that you can start either pushing for more usage or pushing for client engagement. So kind of thinking through what would that look like on the CS side as you can kind of layer those pieces into it. And then if you have the resources, thinking about a customer community. And I'll emphasize if you have the resources, because I've certainly been at companies where we launch a community, nobody is actually in charge of doing it, and we mistakenly think, don't worry, the community will just magically take care of itself. And that does never, ever, ever happens, right? And so you have to make sure that if you're going to do a community, you've got someone who's kind of owning it, they're care and feeding, they're nurturing it, they're making sure it's not turning into a ghost town. But if you can do that, it's awesome, right? It's a really good forum for folks to kind of go in and help themselves a little bit, right? And kind of take on some of that work themselves. And then finally, looking at, are there things that you can shift to a lower resource? And sometimes a more inexpensive resource might mean outsourcing. Sometimes it means just a junior role. Are there certain elements of the job that you can carve out and say, hey, let's get an associate level or a junior level person in here? And if you do this well, you get the bonus of, you've now made a career ladder, right? So now you've got in your pipeline for hiring and talent, right? You can kind of get them in at a lower price point, do a lot of training on the job. They kind of get your knowledge base, and then you've got that as people leave and you need more roles, et cetera. So these are a few elements here. Pick one, pick two, pick three, right? So you can kind of mix and match. Some things work really well in some organizations, some don't. But these are the types of things that you want to kind of think about. Again, with the main of, can we do this, right? Like, do I have the tools? If I'm going to start a drip campaign, do I have someone who's going to be monitoring it? If I do a community, do we have somebody who's going to be looking at it? So those are some thoughts to think through as you start down this path. So talking a little bit about, is it right for your organization? There's some big questions you want to ask yourself. And one is, how complex is your product, right? And be really honest, right? So there are some products that are just complex and they need a high touch in there. They need somebody kind of always going in there. And there's others where, while they might have a heavy tech SaaS component, there's also a huge service component to it, right? A huge people power that if you all of a sudden pull back resources, what's going to happen is that the customer impact is going to decrease, right? And so what you want to think about is, can my customer actually get value and impact from the product with less touch from me? And if so, great, let's lean into it and figure out how to scale. If not, scaling might not be, or at least scaling a CSM might not be the right way, right? Maybe there's other things you can look at there. The other thing is on the data and tools. Do you have what you need to be able to accurately segment out your client base? And more importantly, do you have, the more you lean back from human touch, you're going to need rules and flags, health scores, et cetera, to alert you, alert, something's going on, we need to intervene here earlier rather than later, right? So making sure that you actually have these in place, or that you can get them in place is going to be key. And then self-service. And self-service, I think every company thinks they have self-service, but really looking at it from a customer lens of, is this actually friendly? Is it easy to use? Can you go there and navigate to what you need to find? Is it updated all the time? Is it evergreen? Do you have a good support team that can handle tickets? Because if you pull back, you might get more tickets there. So again, the idea is trying to figure out, are there, as a customer, you don't want them to feel like they're losing anything, right? And so figuring out like, hey, how can I beef up the self-service things I have to offer to make sure that they're kind of left with that support there.
So I was going to say, before we get into the next section, I just want to call out a couple of great comments in there. So somebody was asking about examples of communities. All of us, I'm sure, as consumers have been part of communities. Apple has a really good one. A lot of times communities will just be open where anybody can get in there and customers can talk to each other as well as with somebody from the vendor side. Sometimes communities will be behind a gate and you need a login to be able to get in there. But again, it could have a knowledge base in it, but it'll often have places to interact, ask questions, that sort of thing. And ideally, if you can get customers helping each other, that's really, when communities can really be powerful. You might be able to have product ideas in there and have community members upvote them. So community can look a lot of different ways, but that generally is the concept.
And I know as a customer, I was part of a really cool community as a customer where they actually tapped some of their most, their most champion, their heavy users to be ambassadors. And so they kind of at like, hey, can we lean on you a little bit? Can you, commit to this? And we got some swag or something out of it. And it was fun. Like I loved the product at the time so much. I was like, yeah, I'll be an ambassador. And it was really cool. And like you kind of started getting that networking, and especially for CS, it was a CS, tool. And so it just kind of brought all that together. So there's some products that really lends itself to a nice, robust community out there.
There's also a really good question about how, if you propose some kind of process and then you hear, oh, that won't scale, what do you do? So a little bit later, we're going to talk about ways to kind of pressure test some things and approaches that you could take. And if that doesn't answer the question, that we can get into it more in the Q&A.
Okay, cool.
But now that we've talked about kind of philosophically what scaling is, what it isn't, how to think about your org maturity and when to scale, all that sort of stuff, let's get into the tactical part of things. Want to think about a scaling checklist. We want to give you some guidance about where to start. And we also want to talk about the scaling success triangle, how to build that foundation that I mentioned before that you really want to make solid. So let's talk about the scaling checklist. So there's a few things that you want to make sure that you have in place before you start getting ready to hit the gas. First of all, is this idea of recurring impact. One of the first principles of recurring revenue companies is that recurring revenue is the result of recurring impact. If your customers are not getting business impact from your tool, they will not renew and they will not expand with you. So you need to make sure that all of your teams, marketing, sales, customer success, understands what impact looks like for your customers and that they can deliver it. That is just table stakes. That's the most critical thing. You also want to make sure that your churn rates are under control. So it's not, again, you can scale what doesn't work. So if your churn rates aren't great and you just accelerate, you potentially can just blow that out even more. You want to make sure that you have a solid set of processes. They don't need to be perfect, and you will, as part of scaling, figure out ways to maybe replace them with automation or make other tweaks to them. But you want to make sure that you at least understand generally the processes that drive that recurring impact, so that, again, you have an idea of what works so that you can scale that. And underlying all of this, again, is that clean data. The data is what tells you that your churn rates are under control, that you have a good set of processes that result in hitting impact and thus having customers that are successful, renewing, and growing. So these are just the things that you want to make sure absolutely you have before you start acceleration.
Yeah, and a note on that, the solid processes piece, because it is sometimes, and we work with a lot of companies where they have a lot of processes documented that live somewhere. The question there is really like, are your teams following it, right? You want to make sure you've got a good culture that your teams are following established process. So then it makes it easier when you come in and say, good news, we've made a change. Here's the new thing. They're in lockstep and kind of changing with it. And it's not this culture of, I'm not going to do what I'm told anyway, because it's going to change all the time, right? And so making sure that you've got that kind of culture built in.
And quick comment on this slide, I'm curious, are any of these surprising to you, or are there any things that you're surprised are not on here as items you want to have in place before you're ready to scale? Throw it in the chat if you are surprised by any or see something that you think is missing. Nope, it's all perfect. Great. Okay. Oh, some predictors. Yes, that's actually a good point. I talked about getting that squiggly line evened out, predictability in the business. And so, yes, having some predictors and having clean data so that you can, in fact, be confident that your predictions are, in fact, getting more accurate is a really good point. That's exactly right. And what about headcount? Yeah, when it comes to headcount, that sort of takes off from all of these things. If you have good process, if you know what's working, then when you add headcount, you can onboard people more effectively because things are documented and you know what's working and you know how to train them. And then you can add more of them and be confident that they will all be doing the right thing. If you don't have good processes and you increase headcount, then you can end up having a whole bunch of people doing all different things and you lose all sense of cohesiveness and predictability in it. In terms of how many headcount do you need to have before you're ready to scale, that's less of a formulaic thing. It's more about these measurements.
Yep.
Unless anybody disagrees or has another point of view, which I'd be very interested to hear too. And something about tools. Bruno, I think tools, when it comes to data, so that you have data tools that allow you to see that and analyze it and get the information that you need out of it, yes. But you don't necessarily need to have the scaling tools in place before you're ready to scale. That can be part of the scaling discussion.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Great comments.
Awesome. So let's kind of talk about order of operations, and that kind of pulls in, I think Bruno, you said the people and the process and the tools, right? And so this is kind of how we like to think about it, is it all kind of has to build on itself, right? And so we remember back to, the graphic at the beginning that Beth walked us through, it all falls, right? Because we're building on those superstars. So instead we want to think about how do we build it in a really stable way? And so we want to talk about data at the beginning, right? And so we got to have really good data, because if your numbers are terrible, then how do you know it's even working? And then we want to start layering on, do we have a good process? And then we want to start looking at our tools and our technology. Do we have those? And then we start talking about enablement, right? I have certainly been at organizations where they say, good news, we've got some tools, here's the playbook, go. And there's zero enablement for the team, right? And so that is doomed to failure, right? So what does that enablement look like? And then finally, what's the implication to the organization, right? Do we need to change things on the boxes on where people report and how many headcount we need and all that? But that's kind of the very tip of that iceberg if you've got everything else kind of built up along the way. So let's dive into data, and Beth's going to talk us about some data fun.
Absolutely. So data, Jen mentioned properly segmenting your customer base. What you're looking on the right is our data model, also referred to fondly as our bow tie. The classic marketing and sales funnel does not work for recurring revenue because it only represents the acquisition part of a business. So the bow tie, with the center being when closed one happens, we have new acquisition on the left, and we have all the activities to onboard, drive adoption, renewal, and expansion on the right side of the bow tie. So you want to make sure that you're tracking data across this entire bow tie. One thing is making sure you properly segment your customer base, meaning that if you have a $500,000 client and you're not looking at them separately from your $10,000 clients, you might have an issue. So you want to make sure your segmentation makes sense. It might be by ARR bands, it might be by industry, whatever makes sense for your business, but you want to be able to have the proper segments and track the data. You want to make sure you have a CRM with clean data and baseline metrics for the bow tie, tracking churn rates and the reasons driving that churn. Same with expansion, all these kind of points, and certainly how your employees feel. Now, jumping to the bow tie itself, you can see in those black boxes inside CR1, 2, 3, etc. It stands for conversion rate. So what we like to look at in our data model at Winning by Design is how many deals or how many dollars are making it from one part of the bow tie into the next stage. So CR1 is going to be the number of deals make it from prospect into marketing qualified lead. CR2, marketing qualified lead to sales qualified lead. CR3, sales qualified lead to sales accepted lead. And then CR4 is going to be your win rate. On the right side of the bow tie, where we're focusing for this conversation, CR5 is the deals that win and then make it to first impact, which is the successful onboarding. And again, impact is not just meaning that the tool works and the lights are on. It means that your customers are actually using it and have gotten some kind of impact from it. They ran a report and used it to make a decision. Or if it's a applicant tracking system, they have run a recruit through the entire system, that sort of thing. And you want to know how many customers have successfully made it and transitioned to that point. So that's your conversion rate 5. Conversion rate 6 is going to represent retention or churn, the inverse, and conversion rate 7, the expansion rate. This kind of data is really important to have a handle on, because if you don't know what's happening at this level, it's going to be really hard to know where you need to optimize. So by making sure that you're tracking these kind of data points and that they are in fact predictable, that can help let you know when you are ready to scale, or if any of these are way off from your expectations, it can give you a hint that, wait, hold on, let's look at what's going on here and fix it before we start pouring gasoline on the fire to really speed things up.
Yeah, and with that, you'll want to make sure that before you go into any kind of scaling, changing in this processes to scale, you've got that good baseline, right? So you know ahead of time, here's what we're looking at. Now let's go do something and measure it 3 months later, right? So you can kind of get that data to track to it.
I know data is a really meaty topic, but any questions on this particular, the bow tie, conversion rates, that kind of thing? Okay.
And I think we find a lot as we have, just about every CS org I've ever worked with measures that CR6 and CR7 religiously, right? They know their churn rates, they know their expansion rates. That first impact one tends to be the fuzziest, right? Of really like, what is your first impact and how do you get to it, right? So making sure you've got clarity on that, and then being able to look at, how long is it taking? Is that a spot that you can kind of close up? Because we want to get impact as quick as we can, right? That initial impact as quick as we can to when they bought is the goal.
And a couple of good questions in the chat. So expansions right now are challenging. So how are you adjusting this given the economic climate? So expansions are challenging, so are new acquisitions, to be honest, right now with the economy right now and everyone really taking a close look at their spend. Right now, it truly does come back to impact more than any other time. If you are not delivering impact, the likelihood of your product getting removed from a tech stack is very likely. And certainly, if you are not delivering impact, nobody's going to expand with you. So that has to be the focus, and making sure, right now, if acquisitions are tougher, really leaning into that customer base, focusing on the delivery of that impact so that you can protect your retention and expand where you're able to, because there will still be dollars available if you can have a difference and make an impact on someone's business. So there might be a little bit of, if you're not as focused on impact in your executive business reviews and other things, that's what you'd want to do to address that. In terms of benchmarks and targets, yes, we can talk about that for a really long time. If you take our revenue architecture class, you can learn a lot about benchmarks, but Winning by Design has benchmarks that we do use for all of these conversion rates across the bow tie. The ultimate benchmarking, though, is going to be to benchmark against yourself. And to do that, you need to make sure that you have clean, trustworthy data and that you can track that for, maybe a couple quarters worth, so you can start seeing how you are trending. Industry benchmarks you can use, but be a little wary because there's just so many variables in how people track data. If there's different geos, different factors can influence those. So be a little cautious with industry or peer benchmarks, but certainly our Winning by Design benchmarks are useful. There's a lot of resources on our website, but benchmark against yourself is going to be the best possible thing. And yes, the Jolt effect. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a recent book, and our founder, Jocko, has collaborated with the authors of that to talk about how to navigate sales right now, honestly, and overcome this indecision that a lot of people are having, nervousness to spend money on new acquisitions or on expansion deals. So we have a whole webinar on that and a bunch of content on our website about the Jolt effect as well. Plus, of course, the book is wonderful.
Awesome. All right, so let's shift into kind of this process piece. And Beth touched on a bit about this segmentation, and there's a number of ways to do it. The easiest and what most people kind of start with is ARR, right? Because in general, the more you pay, the more you get, the less you pay, the less, right? And so kind of thinking through, do you have a tech touch, a low touch, white glove, those types of things. What most companies find pretty quickly is that while it's a good place to start, it's more complex than that, right? You could certainly have a customer who comes in and they're spending very little with you, but they have potential, right? If they were given the right care and feeding, they could absolutely be one of your best clients, right? And so you want to put resources there. And similarly, you can get a customer who's been with you for months and years, and they're kind of in maintenance mode and they're paying a lot, but they just don't need as much from you, right? And so, what a lot of companies will do is kind of look at this matrix of saying, hey, what is their revenue today versus their potential? it takes time and finesse, right? A straight, ARR band is easy to do, set up tools for it. But if you can go through that exercise of really thinking about where do my customers fall in this matrix, it's a good segue into kind of like how to start segmenting out these pieces for it. And then you'll want to then layer in, to Beth's point, that data, right? So for each of these segments, however you do it, look at those CR rates across the board, because what you'll tend to find is, maybe the bigger accounts tend to stick around longer, so their churn rates are okay, but the smaller ones aren't. So you can kind of hone in on where do we need to go and kind of pick and choose on where to optimize. And then along with this segmentation piece, you're going to want to think about it in terms of that full customer journey, right? And so, if we look at the mapping, you're going to want to think about, okay, segment A, my tier 1, my lowest touch, what should that journey look like? And the exercise I'd encourage everyone to do, because a lot of companies don't have this today. What is your customer journey? It's in everybody's heads, right? But really map out, what are those milestones we're hitting? What does it look like? What are my touch points today in reality? And then start thinking about, what do I want it to be for these very tiny customers, right? Maybe they don't need EBRs every single quarter, right? Or maybe our bigger customers, we need to start that renewal cycle far earlier because they're complex. So really looking at, by your segments, what should that ideal customer journey be, and then compare it to what it is today. And that will help you identify where are these spots that we need to hone in on. And hopefully you'll also narrow in on some spots where here would be a great thing to do for scaling. Maybe we'll put in a drip campaign here, or maybe we can go and automate this piece here, or whatever, as you kind of layer in those process pieces. Okay, anything on chat, Beth? I wasn't keeping up. Not sure if there's anything we need to go to before we get into the next tools piece.
No, I put in a reply about some data things for startups. We can talk about that more too. And just a comment about implementing a loyalty program, which we can talk about too. Different customer journey for each tier, sort of. That's actually, Jen, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so yeah, so yes, right? They shouldn't look like drastically different, right? Like hopefully you're gonna have, some of those similar milestones with, we know, their first value is gonna be X, Y, and Z. But their journey might look a little different, right? For your bigger ones, it might be that they just get a whole lot more hand-holding during it. Maybe they get one-on-one implementation training, and your lower tiers might get a group training, or maybe your bigger tiers get a quarterly business review, and your lower tiers get it, twice a year. Those types of things. So you'll want like the general sense of that journey to be the same, but then exactly how you're delivering it, back to that scaling, right? It's like, where do we kind of put it, our efforts into kind of driving that journey along. Okay, cool. So let's go on to everybody's favorite topic, tools, tools and technology. And, I think we all know CS leaders who jump at like, I know what will solve the day if we only got this one more tool in there. That would, be the big fix, right? And I think we've all learned by now that the tools are not a magic bullet, right? It's a whole lot more complex than that. And in fact, if you don't think it through and you just throw one more tool into it, it could actually be worse than doing, nothing at all. And so really it's making sure that we've got the right tools in the right place. And so what you want to do is really think about what are you doing with it and what do you want it to do? And so before you jump to adding to it, do a full inventory. There's so many times that teams will get like, we're right in the middle of implementing this new tool. And then you hear someone in sales say, really? Did you know we already had this other tool that does like 90% of what you're paying a new tool to do? So really doing a full inventory of what's available, because there's probably some features and functionalities out there that you're not even tapping into. And so making sure that's going to work together well. And then making sure that your data is going to be clean enough for that tool to utilize. You can get the best tool in the world, but if junk data is coming in, it's not magic, right? And I think for me, the most important thing when I'm thinking about tools is integration. It is my pet peeve. There were so many of these tools that they in theory integrate, and no one takes the time and the effort because it's hard, because of the data, because of the flow. And what ends up happening is our poor CSMs and our folks on the line get stuck with, yeah, I need you to do this in Salesforce and this in Gainsight, and also make sure you send me a Slack on it because these two tools don't talk to each other. So making sure that you're really thinking through less clicks, right? How do I do things in less clicks? And the only way to do that is they need to be fully integrated, not partially integrated, but really, really fully integrated together.
One other comment I'll make about tools, and I see this less than I used to, but tools won't solve if you don't have process. So you can buy, Gainsight, Churn Zero, any of these things, but you need to put your process into the tools. So it's not going to come with it. So that's one of the things that is really important, just to the concept of it being a magic bullet. You want to make sure that you're using tools to help enable what you already have in place and what you've already learned.
Yep.
It's not going to be the fix for you.
Yeah. Which is why on this triangle, right, that's kind of above, it's like, get your processes. Now you can start talking about tools and making sure that you're going into that piece for it. And then you can start shifting into the enablement piece.
And Bern, I'll come back to your question in the chat in a second. In terms of just enablement, don't underestimate the importance and the work involved with change management. Real change does not happen overnight. It will not be easy. Humans resist change. There's also just always a lot of change going on. And so what seems like a small ask might just overwhelm teams as well. You need to think through how you're going to roll out changes, whether it's a new process, tools, whatever, and make sure that you're doing it in a way that makes sense, that allows people to still be set up for success. You're training them, you're giving them time to really learn these behaviors and put them into practice. You need to commit to monitoring and measuring it over time, coaching people on it. And you need buy-in across the board to really make it stick. If you only have, 20% of the people are involved in the process and the other group is doing whatever they want, it's not going to be great. So change management is a huge part of all these different things. As many people know, you can build the most beautiful process in the world, but if it sits in a deck somewhere, it's not going to do anyone any good. So I just always like to emphasize, make sure you take change management seriously and really think through that strategically. And when we talked about testing, like now that you're ready to go, you've checked all the boxes, okay, we think we're ready, we have all these different things. Testing is a really effective way to just make sure before you go full on that things are actually going to work. So see if there's motions that you can identify that can just be adjusted a little bit to be given a lighter touch, and start those. That also helps with change management. Where's your low-hanging fruit? If you really want to test, if you want to blow out a bigger change with the customer journey and how it works, see if you have a couple of customers that you know are friendlies and that would be good test cases, and see if they'd be willing to be part of a beta test and run them through some of these things. Get the reaction, have them help vet it and make it better before you start rolling it out everywhere. If you have some things that you want to do for your CSMs that might have larger books of business, maybe take one or two of those CSMs and get them to, again, sort of beta test the flow of these lighter touches, some automation, those kind of things. Make sure it works before you roll it out to everyone. And then make sure that at the end of the testing period, you're just checking account health, checking in with the customer, making sure you didn't miss anything that could potentially go badly if you really hit the gas and go on it. And certainly adapt. It's never going to be perfect out of the gate. Things are always changing. Even if you roll out a great scaling motion, you want to keep tracking and adjusting as you go. The same way that a plane does, you have your place you take off from and your destination. Planes encounter all sorts of weather in the air. They're constantly adjusting in the air in order to successfully make it to the destination. And you need to think about it the same way with your business. Jen, anything to add on that?
No, I just went too far forward. No, I think it's all great. And I think the, so as you're making your way up the triangle, right, the enablement is super key, and never underestimate the power of change management. And then it's like where you can start to think about, what does this impact mean to the organization, right? And so I like to think about it, it's not just getting the right people on the bus, it's getting them on the right bus and in the right seat. And so when you're shifting these, it might be that, along the way you have said, well, we're going to start segmenting. We don't need this many CSMs working on our top accounts. We need some of them to work on our lower tier accounts. How does that look like? Or maybe we need someone to go and manage a community for us and take on that piece. Or we need someone to go and handle webinars and one-to-many campaigns, right? And so the jobs may change based on all the work you're kind of coming in. And as managers, right, it's our job to kind of help navigate that and help make sure that we're matching the right talent in the right spots. And sometimes it does mean it's the right seat and the right bus is somewhere else, right? And so how do we help people either find their next role or create new positions that didn't exist before and find that in there? And then you'll also want to make sure you're fully communicating this throughout the organization, right? And so that you don't want the sales team thinking, what is going on? And see, this org is changing and they're doing this and they're getting these tools, right? And so making sure that along the way, you're kind of bringing everybody in. So it's not this big surprise. And if if you kind of do everything in this layered approach where you've got like, we've tweaked our processes, we've gotten new tools, we've done a bunch of, it should feel very natural and not this jarring, oh my gosh, we've got to go and reorg the whole thing and rip people, in and out, right? And so that's the goal, is to try to, it's never easy, but that's the goal, is to try to make it where it's not so painful there. Cool. So we've got, we're at our end here. We've got onto the Q&A piece. And so feel free to come off mute or throw some things in the chat, and we can kind of walk through a couple of questions here.
And there's a couple of questions that I was taking notes of that were in the chat before that I want to come back to. So while you're throwing things in the chat or thinking of your questions, let me just circle back. So one thing that came up earlier in the chat was, when you're preparing to scale, how do you internally sell this? If you need investment in this from leadership, board, whatever, how do you do this? And honestly, I'm going to keep coming back to data. This is a really big thing. Some of those testing motions can help, so you can show, hey, we tried this and here were the results. But again, if you have accurate data across that bow tie and you can start modeling out what happens with patterns that are going on. So if you look at your 3 months and you're trending in a good direction, if you can show your board, hey, if we make a little bit of investment here and we can optimize our outcomes and reduce churn by this percentage and increase expansion by this percentage, while also, influencing the long-term cost with the small investment now, it's all about the numbers. Play out those numbers. And as long as you can create a compelling case that way, that's going to work. Now,
yeah, it is always too, it's like for any scaling thing, it does take some upfront investment, right? Very few companies can say, starting tomorrow, let's just do a little less with our, like, it's not the reality, right? You're going to need the tools, you're going to need the data investment, right? And so I think framing it that way, to say, I'm looking at the long term, here's my envision, let me paint the picture, we're going to get to where this is what it looks like. It's going to take some upfront here, and here's what that payback, right? And so it's all about making that business case. But if anyone's asking you to scale, expecting you to do it with no budget, like, that's where you actually push back and say, okay, I can do it. We're going to have to go and make a plan on how this is going to play out over time.
The other question here I like is, how do you measure ideal customer profile customers and non-ideal customer profile customers going through the bow tie process? So ICP is a whole discussion topic in and of itself, but ideally what you're doing is looking at your most successful customers on the far right side of the bow tie, the ones that are getting the most adoption, the most impact, they're renewing at the highest rates, they're expanding a lot, they're staying with you a long time, so their LTV is high. And you're looking at that to refine your ICP. What situations, what industries, what do those customers look like? What's different about them? And feed that back to your marketing and sales team on the left side of the bow tie, so that they can get more customers that look like them. So this is that virtuous cycle, right? This loop of information. If you're tracking it effectively on the right side of the bow tie, you feed it back onto the left side, so you can just continuously build more and more of a pipeline of ICP customers coming in. So as you start seeing, you'll see from the data, if there's a bad fit customer that closes, you'll probably get a sense pretty early, even during onboarding, if it's not going to work. Some may just make the decision to leave pretty early in, but at some point, sometimes you do in fact need to fire customers because they're not a good fit. You're going to expend massive amounts of time and energy attempting to make them successful when maybe they shouldn't have been sold in the first place. So Bern, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it's helpful to think about, because I've been in companies before where we have a nice ICP, we know what that is, but there's other verticals that we think we might be a good fit in. We just haven't quite proven it out yet. And so we start to bring those in. And what we actually did was we actually made a team that just specialized in them. So those CSMs got, we call them our new verticals, clients to work with them, so that it were almost kind of incubated, right? So we could start to, look at their metrics differently to say like, okay, let's try it for a few quarters and see, are we getting success? Are we not? So that you can hopefully make the decision on, wow, this vertical is a great fit. Cool, let's invest more, or stop selling this one. It's a terrible fit. But using that data to do it is really helpful to go back to your sales team, because I think CS folks, we tend to just say, these are terrible clients, we don't like them, they're not good. And if you can back that up with data to say, no, I've cohorted them out, I can show you, here are these, they take longer to onboard, they never get to first impact, they're a bear to renew, or whatever, can help make that case go a lot further. All right.
So questions, or for those of you who have things that have really worked with scaling, whether I know there's some Winning by Design folks on the line, but also the rest of you, comments are welcome just as much as questions. Or challenges to anything we said too. We love that.
Or if you've seen things that have gone wrong, those are always great too. If you're like, oh, I did this and here's my lessons or my learning, it'd be great to share. I know for me, I am always guilty of the change management piece. I get very excited as a leader of like, I've solved it, guys. I made a new process and the new tool is in, go. And everyone's looking at me like, what are you talking about? We have not been in all of these implementation meetings and all of this. And so I think that's, for me, is always a struggle, as I feel like people should just naturally do it here.
I like that comment. Launching digital application to engage customers was always a great option with an FAQ section. Yep.
See, Julian is raising his hand.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes,
No
Julian,
problem.
go ahead.
No problem. First of all, thank you for this beautiful webinar. I think one of the things that have helped in my startup has been, first, the theory behind the book to get to 10 million annual recurring revenue of Jaco. That was very good from Winning by Design. I think it's kind of like a kitchen recipe to cook a startup, and it's very nice. And the other thing is that when you're in a startup and you want to start having your different processes and hiring your people, it is difficult for us to decide when to hire the people. And I think sometimes to externalize some services such as prospecting to start understanding your initial measurements might help, so that you don't hire someone and train them for a year and suddenly it didn't go the right way, and then realize that it's not going the right way. What are your thoughts about this concept? And sorry to ask that much of a startup, because I know for sure that once you get to 10 million annual recurring revenue, well, then you can apply a lot of Winning by Design's methodology.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to hear, I know we have a bunch of Winning by Design folks, so I would love to hear what some of you have to say. I feel like if there is a way to test out some things, like you said, with a third party before you really make the investment in a role or something like that, if you can, that's a great option. And just in general, the whole idea of making a smaller investment in something to get some data before you really make a fuller investment, just in general, is a great practice if you can think about it that way and find a way to engineer it. Anybody else have comments?
Yeah, the thing was, it's always like, how do you be scrappy, right? Like just enough to prove you've got something and then kind of invest in it, right? Is the hard, and that's, I think, the startup dilemma. Right? It's like, where do I put my limited dollars to go and get to the impact I'm looking for?
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of companies, this is David, a lot of companies will hire slow and build a team and test that team and test the processes within the team, prove it out and see if it works, and then go hire the rest of the team. Instead of hiring 5 or 6 and putting in the processes and then finding out it didn't work, now you've got change management for 5 or 6 people. You might have to let some people go. Start with 1, test it out, build the processes, see how people interact, and then build from there.
Great point. And I think it sort of ties in a little bit, but Nadine asked a question about maturity with applications, and is there a way to start small? And I think there is, like any place where you can see low-hanging fruit to test out things is fantastic. Really, really love that. And then Matthew, your point in the chat about a huge route to scaling is consistency. And I love this analogy that you use about when everyone does things similarly and predictably, you can go faster and do more, like an expressway. If everybody's driving consistently and similar speeds and all that, it's much better than if everybody's doing something different. It can just create a huge traffic jam. So that is, I think, a really excellent point.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to that process, right? Like, is that in your culture to say, like, this is the way we do things? Not everybody is, making their own. I don't want to do this process. I have my own way of doing it. It's like it works for a while. Back to that, toppling at the beginning startups. It works for everybody to keep their notes in different places and all of that. But at some point, it's like we got to be consistent because we want to move fast and we want to be able to make changes. And the only way to do that is to get everybody super consistent across the board.
And one last comment, because I know we're at the top of the hour, the last comment that came in about before going live with customers, testing with employees. This is a fantastic idea. If you have one little group of people building something and then going to roll it out, before you roll it out, check out other internal employees who can review it and pressure test. Your support team is an excellent resource to use. They know what's going on in your customers' heads. They love to be part of different things, and often they're not pulled in to just review things and give their opinion about stuff. So leverage the employees that you have who might bring fresh eyes to something that you've been working on for a while. And I know we're at the top of the hour. People have to go. I'm so grateful for all of you for attending, for the questions. We will be sending out the recording. I hope this was valuable. Hopefully a good use of your time. And we hope that you join us again for more Winning by Design webinars.
Awesome. Everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.